ILR. Um, for many summers, Dr. Paul Ortiz has reviewed a book for us, and the book that he has chosen this summer, I had never read until the last month. I don't know how I got to be 90 years old without having read Douglas's narrative, but it was fascinating. And I encouraged my oldest great-grandson to read it, and he's reading it this week. So thank you for the recommendation, Paul. Dr. Ortiz is the current director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program and professor of history at the University of Florida. He's just stepped down in the last week or so from being head of the faculty union, the University of Florida chapter. So he's probably somewhat relieved, but I know he continues to be the advisor to that group. Paul is a third-generation military veteran and a first-generation university graduate, and his pathway to being a PhD is certainly not the usual one. His pathway to academia included years of organizing work with the United Farm Workers, the Farm Labor Organizing Committee, and many other unions. Well, I introduced him for so many years that I don't want to take up more time, but I asked him if he would start by telling us what his most recent project he's working on. So Paul, take it away.
Thank you, Roy, and it's always a tremendous honor for me to have such an esteemed colleague introduce me, and it's just great to be here working with Julie and the fabulous work that you do at Oak Hammock and the ILR in particular is more important than ever. And we've had the opportunity, many of us, to be on kind of a summer reading odyssey over the past several years. And it's such a treat to recognize so many of us who have kind of stuck with me. I appreciate your loyalty. We have read together William Faulkner, Herman Melville. Some of you mentioned to me that it took you a decade or more to finish Moby Dick, but we finally did it together. We've read Toni Morrison, Harper Lee. I remember the summer of Go Set a Watchman was just really electric, the follow-up to Kill a Mockingbird, and we had a vibrant discussion about those two books. It's really just such a fun opportunity and really incredibly timely to be able to talk with the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. But Roy also asked me, and you can see here, I really appreciate how welcoming you are, because in a few minutes I've turned this really tidy space into something that looks like my office at UF. Was just a mess. As Sheila can tell you, when you walk into my office, it's like books are piled up, and I don't know how that happens, but it does happen over the years. And so, but one of the exciting projects that we're working on, the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, which is germane to the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, is that we just started working about a year ago. We got a grant, which now I think is going to run us 3 years at least, working with the National Park Service to interview the descendants of conductors and freedom seekers of the Underground Railroad. And this is a topic of historical interest, which is just caught fire. Our students are amazed and fascinated by it. We're interviewing, just to give you a small sample, we interviewed the descendant of Robert Smalls about a month ago. One of our students who was on the interview team is Gullah Geechee from the Low Country of South Carolina, also named Robert Smalls, because it turns out that a lot of African-American families named actually in the immediate wake of emancipation, changed their name to Smalls, their surnames, because of his heroic work in the Union Navy. And so it's just so amazing to be able to take our students to interview these incredible people. We interviewed Robert Seeley a couple of months ago. He's the direct descendant of Thomas Garrett, who was a close friend of Frederick Douglass, who was part of the Friends, was able to help liberate over 2,000 African Americans who've been in slavery. And in the Delaware kind of connection to there, we'll be flying out to California in early September. I'm leading a team of students, grad students and undergrads. We'll be interviewing William Gould IV. William Gould IV is the direct descendant of William Gould, who was an escaped slave, and his story is kind of a corollary to the Robert Smalls story. And by the way, Hollywood, at least before the strike, is beginning to work on a film, a feature-length film about Robert Smalls and his incredible odyssey during the Civil War of taking his family out of slavery, eventually actually commanding a Union gunboat and taking it into battle. But the William Gould story is just as incredible because Gould also escaped out of slavery early in the Civil War and served with the United States Navy's Northern Blockading Squadron. And what they did, and of course, because I'm an Army veteran, I always have to make fun of my Navy counterparts. These sailors saw serious combat service because what they did and what Gould did, and his William Gould IV discovered his diary. William Gould IV, by the way, is a retired law professor at Stanford, labor law, and he found William Gould's diary just in a family attic, just so incredible. And we knew a little bit about the story, but until the diary was brought out, we didn't know the full story, which was that the Northern Atlantic Blockading Squadron played such a pivotal role in winning the Civil War for our country. And one of the many things that it did, and William Gould saw service, was to actually, they would sail to, like, right off the coast of England, and the British, they were kind of two-timers during the Civil War, right? They said they were neutral, but they were also building ships for the Confederacy in Liverpool and other ports. And so William Gould saw service actually in intercepting these ships right as they were built, capturing them and commandeering them for the United States. So there's a lot of amazing stories in the Underground Railroad that are just now getting to be known. This is something, by way of introduction into narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. When Frederick Douglass published his book in 1845, of course, he had to leave the country because he revealed enough about his life in slavery, especially in the Eastern Shore of Maryland and in Baltimore proper, that basically made him a target for slave catchers, and his life was in jeopardy. Douglass, throughout his life, and I think you begin to get this when you're reading the tone of the narrative, Douglass was attacked, beaten, life threatened repeatedly because he would say things that people didn't want to hear, right? He would speak out against slavery. He would speak in support of women's rights. He would speak out against the racism against Chinese immigrants in the 1860s. And he was actually physically attacked for all these different reasons. It wasn't that he was just attacked physically because of his stance about slavery. I mean, that's like a no-brainer. But when we think about Douglass and why he's become such a beloved figure in American history, and I'm going to play a poem for us to kind of start things off in just a couple of minutes. It's interesting to think about, and what I wanted to talk to you today about the narrative is to think about the narrative as containing a set of codes or clues as to the really, really important issues in American history that Douglass learned about as a boy. Because much of this narrative is written from the perspective of a young Black boy. And his experiences, he begins talking to us about his experience in slavery from the time he was about age 5, okay? And that, in a literary sense, connects the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass to several of the books that we've read together. It very much connects us to Kill a Mockingbird. It very much connects us to, remember when we read Mark Twain's The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Connects us very intimately to those great works, because these are works written by children, or written from a children's perspective to a big sense. And they're the ways in which children in the United States in the 19th century and the 20th century interpreted the world around them, and especially issues of injustice, of inequality. Remember, one of the things we talked about in To Kill a Mockingbird was, isn't it amazing that it's Scout and Jem and Boo Radley who are the real heroes of that story? It's not really Atticus Finch. And the publication of Go Set a Watchman kind of clinches that thesis. But it's Boo Radley who saves lives in the film. It's Scout and Jem who are walking down the road one day, and one of them turns to the other and says, in To Kill a Mockingbird, my favorite passage, why are these adults doing this? And the sister and brother say to each other, well, that's just, they don't know any better. They just don't know any better. Or probably the greatest novel, I don't know what the greatest novel in American history, I kind of go back and forth between Mark Twain, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Melville, Moby Dick, Toni Morrison, Beloved. My wife Sheila, many of you know, are like, Paul, at it again. The same. I'll have the 3 books and I'll kind of look at them and I'll think, it's just incredible. All 3, I think there's arguments, but The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, remember how many of us read that book together, and again, a great affinity to narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, because these are books about people whom Melville called the meanest mariners, renegades, and castaways of the society. These are the people who you wouldn't normally commune with. You wouldn't want your child dating any one of them. They're sailors, they're slaves, they're homeless vagabond youths. Like, who could be more of a kind of vagabond than Huckleberry Finn? Or who could be weirder than Boo Radley? Who could be weirder or stranger to see show up in Nantucket in the 1840s than a former slave called Frederick Douglass? These are the outcasts of the society. These are the people that Herman Melville chose to help him narrate one of the great novels in American history. In the 1850s, all of this stuff was happening in a literary basis. Margaret Fuller, Walt Whitman, Henry David Thoreau. Fuller actually reviewed this book, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. She really liked the book. She talked about the sharpness of the prose. I believe she had seen Douglass speak. Henry David Thoreau had heard Douglass speak and had invited him to a venue near Walden Pond to give a lecture about slavery. And Thoreau we know he was deeply moved by this book, as so many others were at the time it was published. But in addition to just thinking about the book in 1845, and now we've had this incredible experience of reading a book which, once it went back into print in the early 20th century, I doubt has been out of print for more than a few months at the most. I want us to think about what Douglass means to us now. Couldn't have picked a more timely book to read this present situation that we're in Florida, in terms of African American history, in terms of Black studies. The only thing that's changed since last year when we got together to talk, and you had that wonderful series, Julie, about critical race theory, which was astonishing in its depth, the candor of the discussions, the ways in which you use the series to connect past, present, and future through critical race theory, which isn't just a name, it's a way of thinking about US history that should involve Mark Twain, that should involve Herman Melville, that should involve Toni Morrison, that should involve Kurt Vonnegut. Oh, and by the way, we just named the 4 most banned authors in the United States. Why are they banned over the years? Not just now. We have a lot of talk about the current government in Tallahassee. There's frustration. I know I'm very frustrated, but I have to think back on when I first encountered Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. It was a banned book in my school district in Bremerton, Washington. Why? It was deemed to be too anti-war. It had been written by a combat veteran who was a POW during the war, Kurt Vonnegut, but a little dangerous. Maybe you should have a parental discretion or something. I don't know. Anyway, but Narrative, also a book which was obviously heavily banned in one half of the entire country when it was first published. And again, Douglas has to leave the country after publishing it, not just for his safety, but also for the safety of people around him. He didn't reveal the whole element of how he escaped from slavery until really towards the end of his life. The reason that I'm so excited about UF, our Underground Railroad project now, is that we're learning things about the Underground Railroad that could never be published openly. Because even decades after the war, if you reveal that you had been like a way station person, like say Anna Marie Douglas, Frederick Douglass's first wife, and you talked about who you worked with, you were still endangering lives because there was a lot of anger against the anti-slavery movement even decades after the end of the war. But let's think about what Frederick Douglass means now. There's a clip, Julie, in the YouTube, and this is a poem. As Roy can tell you, I never go anywhere without my handouts. I feel naked without my handouts. And so this handout is titled Litany at the Tomb of Frederick Douglass. It's a two-sider. And Martina Espada, who's a National Book Award winner in poetry, is going to read the poem for us. And you can follow along on the handout. And the occasion is the day and the days after the election of Barack Obama in 2008. And Espada happens to be in Rochester, which was a town that Frederick Douglass lived in many years of his life, and he's buried in Rochester. And so this is Martina Espada reading the poem. The acoustics are not fabulous, so hopefully you'll be able to catch most of it, but if you can't, you can read along the poem Litany at the Tomb of Frederick Douglass.
I was in Rochester, New York, right after Barack Obama was elected in November of 2008. I am usually somewhere else, and I happen to be in Rochester. Something else in Rochester, too, the tomb of Frederick Douglass. So I paid that tomb a visit and was astonished to find it had become an altar. It's important to visit the altar of that history because you and I and all of us must make history again and again and again and again. This is a poem called Litany at the Tomb of Frederick Douglass, Mount Hope Cemetery, Rochester, New York, November the 7th, 2008. This is the longitude and latitude of the impossible. This is the epicenter of the unthinkable. This is the crossroads of the unimaginable. The tomb of Frederick Douglass 3 days after the election. This is a world spinning away from the gravity of centuries where the grave of a fugitive slave has become an altar. This is the tomb of a man born as chattel who taught himself to read in secret, scraping the letters in his name with chalk on wood, now on the anvil flat stone. A This is the tomb of a man in chains who left his fingerprints on the slave breaker's throat so the whip would never carve his back again. Now a labor union t-shirt drapes itself across the stone, offered up by a nurse, a janitor, a bus driver. A sticker on the sleeve says, "I voted today." This is the tomb of a man who rolled his call to arms off the press, peering through spectacles at the abolitionist headline. Now a newspaper spreads above his dates of birth and death. The headline says, "Obama wins." This is the stillness at the heart of the storm that began in the body of the first slave dragged aboard the first ship to America. Yellow leaves descend in waves, and the newspaper flutters on the tomb like the sails Douglas saw in the bay, like the eyes of a slave closing to watch himself escape with the tide. Believers in spirits would see the pages trembling on the stone and say, "Look how the slave boy teaches himself to read." I say a prayer, the first in years, that here we bury what we call the impossible, the unthinkable, the unimaginable, now and forever. Amen.
Thank you, Julian. We'll go back. That looks like a fun show. So the question, in thinking about the poem and the fact that Douglas continues to be, thinking about the poem and different parts of the world that I've been in where Frederick Douglass is still an icon, in some ways growing in stature. The question I have is, how did a former slave rise to such a stature? There are hundreds, actually thousands of slave narratives, ex-slave narratives in the 19th century. And there's certainly other former slaves that became incredibly popular. You think of the family of the Reverend Henry Highland Garnett, obviously Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth. Many of these were people, of course, that Douglass himself knew. And what is it, why would someone write a poem about Frederick Douglass decades later, after Douglass's passing? Matutina Espada, the great Puerto Rican poet, has written extensively about Douglass. What are some of the connections between Latino history and African American history here? And when we get back to the presentation, one of the things I want to also ask us to do as well is to think about the relationship between Frederick Douglass and certain individuals. The person I'm thinking now, of course, is Abraham Lincoln, because there's an importance here to the story of Douglass and Lincoln. And let me give you just one. There's a lot of Lincoln Douglass anecdotes that historians have recently discovered or rediscovered. So one of them is the day that Abraham Lincoln gives his second inaugural address. And it's after a tough campaign. And it's after a presidential campaign that he ran against General George McClellan, in which Lincoln was pretty certain he was going to lose the war, or lose the election, and then probably lose the war. If he lost the election, General McClellan was essentially saying, hey, it's been 4 years, we haven't been able to achieve a victory, it's time to just let the South go. And that's what he campaigned on. And so if Lincoln lost the election, there was wide understanding that the war was over, that we'd have at least 2, if not 3, different nations. There was talk about the West splitting off and creating its own nation. So a couple things that happened before that second inaugural. One is that Lincoln actually called Frederick Douglass for a private meeting. This was quite unusual. And Douglass himself was perplexed. Why would the president call me in for a private meeting? And the reason that that President Lincoln called Frederick Douglass for this meeting, which again is rooted in the experiences of Douglass in his narrative, is that Lincoln had a plan. He said, Mr. Douglass, I'm going to lose this election. But you have made it clear to me that this is an abolition war. That phrase was Douglass's war. Because when the war first broke out, Abraham Lincoln said, this is not primarily about slavery. It's about making the Union whole again. And remember, Lincoln early on in the conflict says, if I have to preserve slavery to save the Union, I will do it. Because preserving the Union is my number one strategy. And Douglass is the fly in the ointment, if you will. And in correspondence and other speeches, Douglass says, Mr. Lincoln, you can't save the Union and preserve slavery. It's impossible. You don't want to admit it yet, but this war, and Jill, if we can go to the presentation, thank you. This war is about slavery. And pretending it's not, and refusing to enlist the Negro as a soldier, and refusing to listen to General Fremont and your own commanders, who are saying tens of thousands of Negroes are coming to our lines. They're working as nurses. They're digging trenches. They're building railroad lines for us when we can't get our own white people to do those things because they want us to win the war. And many of Lincoln's own field commanders were saying, President Lincoln, we need the Negro to win this war. And initially Lincoln said, no, we can't do that. I don't want to alienate the South beyond a certain point. We want to get them back into the Union. And making it a war about slavery will preclude that from happening. So Douglass wins the argument because by the time of 1863, Lincoln realizes that he cannot win the war and we cannot make the Union whole again without Black men in arms, without Black communities mobilized to do so many different things in the war. It would take me hours to explain. I mean, one of the things is that many Black communities in the South actually help Union POWs out of their prisons and really the concentration camps that they were in and help spirit Union soldiers into freedom. There are hundreds of narratives of Yankee soldiers who express gratitude to slave communities for helping them escape from places like Andersonville. How many of you have heard of Andersonville? It was a horrific place to be in. Winslow Homer has a famous painting. One of my dissertation advisors, Peter Wood, wrote about at Andersonville. And the painting is of an African-American woman standing in her doorway looking at a Confederate soldiers marching Union prisoners into the hell of Andersonville. And one of Peter Wood's interpretations is that maybe she's standing there thinking about how are we going to help free these men from this abysmal place? And we know that that happened quite frequently. But anyway, President Lincoln calls Douglass in. He says, Mr. Douglass, I'm going to lose this election. This is before the election happens in 1864. And says, I want you to gather your best men around you, go to the South, create a revolution, and defeat slavery from within. Get as many slaves as you can and tear up the system from within. And Douglass is thinking, we have to imagine Douglass is because we don't have all of his words on this, but Douglass has got to be thinking, isn't this like John Brown's plan? And didn't Abraham Lincoln say that John Brown was a dangerous fanatic just a few years earlier? But this is how the pace of events, Douglass stayed on top of the events. He saw these things happening. He realized it was an abolition war. And we think the first time that Douglass uses the phrase abolition war was 2 weeks after Gettysburg. And historians now, the Union victory at Gettysburg, and historians now believe that Frederick Douglass played a role, a political role to Abraham Lincoln, kind of the way that Malcolm X played a role with Martin Luther King. That is, Malcolm X often said public things militantly to create a space for Dr. King. We know this now because we're actually going through Coretta Scott King's papers, and she talks about meeting Malcolm in Selma, Alabama, and they're sitting in a church, and Malcolm says, you know this stuff I'm saying about your husband, Mrs. King, I want you to know that I'm saying it for a reason. I have nothing but the greatest respect for Dr. King. But the white power structure knows that if they don't deal with your husband, they have to deal with me. And that's why Malcolm strategically said a lot of those things, which sounded outrageous. But that's the reason that Frederick Douglass called it an abolition war right after Gettysburg. Oh, and guess what? Vicksburg had just fallen too. So that's one anecdote. The other anecdote I wanted to share with you from the second inaugural, and now we're fast forwarding a little bit. Dangerous to ask me to talk about Frederick Douglass because there's just so many stories. The other story, though, behind this quote is that Abraham Lincoln, and you know when you pick inaugurals, presidential inaugurals, we sent the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program and UF Women's Studies sent 16 of our students to the inauguration of President Donald Trump. And to do oral history interviews at the inauguration and to do interviews with the tens of thousands, or some of the tens of thousands of activists who had come for the National Women's March, which was concurrent with the inauguration. And when you put together an inauguration, there's a lot of theater and choreography involved. And where people sit is very important. And so President Lincoln specifically required that Frederick Douglass sit very close to him, to President Lincoln, when Lincoln was giving the second inaugural. And after the inaugural, Lincoln wades through this vast kind of menagerie of generals and foreign dignitaries. And he says, I want to get to my friend, Frederick Douglass, because I want to hear what he thought about the inaugural. And Douglass says, why? Why me? I'm just an insignificant ex-slave. And Lincoln says to him, Mr. Douglass, there's no man in the country whose opinion I value more than your opinion. Now, how do we get to that stage in history where someone like Abraham Lincoln and where he came from becomes a friend and a confidant somehow of Frederick Douglass? So that's Douglass's tomb in Rochester. And as I mentioned, Douglass, really from the narrative onward, but it is important to understand that the narrative comes out of Douglass's many speaking engagements. He was already a very popular anti-slavery speaker, and just Douglass had a propensity, we'll call it, to say things that were very unpopular. The thing to understand about Frederick Douglass is that most of the causes he advocated, save for one, didn't succeed during his own lifetime. The struggle against slavery being the most successful. But remember that Douglass was also there at Seneca Falls in 1848. And he was pivotal behind pushing the resolution in support of full political equality for American women. That was not achieved by the end of his lifetime. The struggle against lynching. When Douglass passed away in the 1890s, lynching was at its high tide. Anti-Chinese racism, anti-Japanese racism. And what I want us to remember is most of these struggles that Douglass engaged in, he either lost or they had not achieved kind of a fruition or a victory by the time he passed away. He was already passed by the time of the passage of the 19th Amendment. And of course, there are many other anti-Asian immigration bills that passed in the early 20th century, and they're still happening. And that's the other continuity, I think, of Frederick Douglass, is that the struggles he engaged in, hey, guess what? They're almost all still struggles right now. And so that's another reason I think Douglass is so timely. So I'm going to kind of go through some of these pretty quickly. And as usual, we'll make Julie will make this is publicly accessible. You got the copy of it. Please share it with folks, because I will be going through some of this pretty rapidly. But there's a lot of aspects of Frederick Douglass's life, and that there's a huge Douglass scholarship. And one of the areas is the visual. Frederick Douglass was the most photographed person of the 19th century in America. He had at least 160 portraits of him made. As Roy can tell you, back in those days, a portrait was much more than just sitting for a photo, right? But Douglass liked the originals, the original daguerreotypes. He didn't like the engravings. He didn't trust the artists, engravers, who were very skilled people back then. He didn't trust them to get the image correctly. He wanted the original image. He was a huge fan of photography as it became more sophisticated, more technologically advanced. The big thing, of course, was even when you had the first generation of daguerreotypes, then photographs, engravings, you couldn't replicate those. There was no technology to copy them. So that was always a problem as well. But think about why, again, think of the narrative, why the visual image of an enslaved person would be so critical to Douglass. Douglass felt that photographs were even more important than almost any other genre you can think of in demonstrating our humanity. This is who I am. I am a man. I am a human being. You cannot deny that. You can even deny that. You can say that someone else wrote the narrative, that a bleeding heart white person wrote the narrative, and that's what a lot of people said after the narrative was published. Oh, a white person must have written that. A Negro could never have written so eloquently and so passionately. But this is something you cannot deny. And Douglass, this was interesting to me. When I was in grade school, boys were not allowed to smile either. When we took class pictures, if any of us were smiling, I don't know if some of you remember this, we had to take the picture over again. Boys were not supposed to smile, okay? I guess we got it from Frederick Douglass. I wanted to talk about some of the key passages in the book which help us get to these iconic moments. We all know that Frederick Douglass wrote the incredible speech, "If there is no struggle, there's no progress." And I have the speech. I printed up just a small excerpt of it. It's on the flip side of your Litany at the Tomb of Frederick Douglass handout. This is an iconic moment in political history. This is someone saying that you people are talking about the Supreme Court, your Congress, which back then, there's Congress, there's the Senate, senators are not directly elected, and the presidency, and you're putting a lot of faith in these big institutions. But let me tell you something I've learned as a slave. Without struggle, there is no progress. Why would you even look to the Supreme Court for hope? Unless you're struggling and forcing them to do the right thing, you can't put faith in any institutions. And Douglass said this over and over and over again. If there is no struggle, there's no progress. But I would argue that it comes organically out of his experiences as a slave. I remember Roy, one of my dear dissertation advisors, Larry Goodwin, populist moment, one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. Larry would tell us in grad seminar, he would almost beat it into us, all learning is experiential. He would say over and over and over again, he would say, how do you think those East Texas farmers came up with the idea of the sub-treasury? a plan to replace the banks and put farmers in charge of a democratic money supply. So radical for its time that even to this day, it puts the fear of God in the New York Times editorial board and the Wall Street Journal editorial board. And every time every chance they get, they use the term populist in a pejorative manner. But that's not the original interpretation of populism. And that's what Douglas, or that's what Larry meant by all learning is experiential. So we think about this great political formulation, without struggle, there's no progress. It seems to be kind of common sense, except for we forget it over and over and over again. Frederick Douglass was always that person who walked into the room to tell you, don't be satisfied where we are now. The minute we become smug and we think that something is set in stone and we can never go backwards, that's when the problem begins. The minute we trust our rights to big institutions, at almost that point that we've lost them essentially. And this battle with Covey is something I think that teaches Douglass what becomes a political maxim, which now we connect with Frederick Douglass. But it comes about in part during this fight with Covey. And a lot of people misinterpret this fight, by the way. A lot of people will say that, Douglass got in this battle with Edward Covey. Oh, and by the way, guess who lives in Edward Covey's home? Or guess who moved in about, 15 years ago into Covey's home? You all know his name. The place is called Mount Misery. Does that give you a clue? Donald Rumsfeld. Yeah. These places are still around. As Roy can tell you, historical preservation is so important now. It's never been more important than it is now. Saving buildings, putting names on places, remembering, why do we have this place? Why do we have this land? Where did it come from? Mount Misery, how illuminating, right? But a lot of people know this story about Douglass and the slave breaker Covey, but they assume that after the battle, which Douglass, by all accounts, was pretty successful in, the physical encounter, the assumption is that Douglass immediately escaped from slavery. No, it was 4 years. He was in slavery for 4 years after this battle, but it was important nonetheless. Another aspect of the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, which is so precious, is this internal glimpse that the narrative gives us into the slave communities that Douglass grew up in. And the Sabbath school sequence in the narrative is so very important for so many different reasons. This is one part of the book that we could talk about for hours and hours and hours. But I believe that it helps us understand what becomes Douglass's analysis of history, which is there's a status quo, there's the powers that be, they say certain things, and how often does Douglass use the word Christian? If you have this in ebook, Google that, because Douglass wants to emphasize to us all of these things are happening in a Christian nation. Oh, and guess what? A lot of the slave masters in the Eastern Shore of Maryland are ministers. Again, remember Mark Twain, Huckleberry Finn. He makes a special point of making a minister one of the main people who's searching after Jim. He wants that money. That's his religion. It's money. It's not Christ. And so that Sabbath school sequence is so important because it allows Douglass to be, in a sense, a community organizer. That's not a term that would have existed back then. That's a term we would use now. But Douglass is helping to gather people together who know they are under, if you're caught trying to learn how to read and write as a slave during this time, it could cost you your life. This is not just going to a Sunday school and getting a lesson. If the master gets it in his mind that this is going on and he catches you or she catches you, it could be a death sentence for you. So Douglas, to him, I believe to the end of his life, this is one of the most inspiring moments of his life. And again, as a young man growing up, he gets a vision of what community could be. This is a community of struggle. Without struggle, there is no progress. Just learning the stuff I was teaching, they could be given 39 lashes. And yet they came week after week after week. It was a really inspiring experience for Douglas. There's critiques of narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass of the book, just as there are critiques of every great work of literature. And one of the most obvious critiques is the relative invisibility of women as agents of history, as subjects of history, not objects. Douglass generally writes about Black women, and even white women to a certain extent, as objects of history. And he tells us the stories of the horrific attacks, the rapes, the punishments, the dismemberments that occur that are visited by white masters and overseers on Black women. That's a very important part of the narrative, and that's a staple of many of the slave narratives of the mid-19th century. You're trying to open a lid on Southern chivalry, on American fair play, and you're saying, there's nothing chivalrous here, nothing fair here, nothing Christian here. But what Douglass doesn't give us in the narrative is a positive sense of the role that Black women constantly played in keeping Black communities alive under these hellish conditions, because it's Black women who are the foundations of slave communities. And Douglass personally, and he alludes sometimes in his speeches to his first wife, Anna Murray, but she is the person who provides him with the resources to help him get his freedom. She's the person that, according to Douglass himself, gives him one of the first visions of what a free life could be for a Black person. It's not a famous person he's looking at. There's no Booker T. Washington. There's no Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, where would you go for a role model like that? It's his first wife before they're married, and she leaves after the South but she's free at the time. And she's able to follow him north after he escapes from slavery with her help. So that's a critique of the narrative, is kind of the allusion of Black women to the narrative. Years after, and as I was writing up this presentation, I was thinking, how is it that Frederick Douglass maintains a certain stature, a certain historical stature that seems to grow and grow? I mean, there's some troughs here and there, but the narrative is a long distance runner. It's a serious long distance runner. I mean, my God, imagine writing a book in 1845 and it's still in print so many decades afterwards. But part of the reason is that new generations of freedom thinkers, I'll call them, read the narrative, even if they didn't read it in 1845. Think about Douglass's career, about what he meant to the nation. And here, Mary Church Terrell, this is one of my favorite moments, because this is the 60th anniversary of the Seneca Falls Conference, the first major national women's rights conference held in the United States. And Mary Church Terrell, of course, wasn't there in the original conference, but she's thinking back. She heard stories from her elders about that conference. And she talks about, and so she's one of the keynote speakers at the 60th anniversary of Seneca Falls. And her entire speech is dedicated to the role of Frederick Douglass in that first conference. And this outrageous, this outrageous, I mean, there were people there, amazing people that we admire in American history, who in 1848 said, we can do a lot of things, but we just can't call for equal political rights for women. It's too outrageous. We need to kind of wait. Douglass made mistakes throughout his career, but this was not one of them. He said, no, why wait? Demand it now. And so Mary Church Terrell here is talking about the role that Douglass played in that particular struggle. Now, thinking about kind of moving towards wrapping up, so I want to leave time for questions. I want to kind of conclude with a few observations about what made Douglass different than someone like, say, Henry David Thoreau or a Ralph Waldo Emerson. They all knew each other. But what's the difference between a Douglass and a Thoreau? Part of and what I'm trying to get at here is that, and this is kind of teleological, it's a leading question. We know that Douglass becomes a leader in the anti-slavery movement. We know that Douglass becomes a leader in the anti-imperial movement. He denounces the war, the US invasion of Mexico. Well, Thoreau does all those things, but Henry David Thoreau is not really part of a movement per se. He's more of an individualist. So what is it that allows, I mean, I'm not taking anything away from him. In fact, I think Walden may be, maybe we go over Walden next summer. Magnificent text. But there's a difference between Douglass and Thoreau I'm trying to get at here through the narrative. And it's that Douglass always saw himself as part of a community, whereas Thoreau defined his political ideology in some senses against community. And let's leave aside for now which one is better than the other. Thoreau had some pretty valid reasons to call out his local community. He said, y'all are supporting a lot of injustice, slavery, US invasion of Mexico, a lot of bad things, oppression of sailors, which was, we talked about it when we read Melville, right? And Thoreau, that makes him want to withdraw from society and be critical of it, but be critical as a writer and as kind of this iconoclastic individual. One of my favorite episodes in American history, Roy, apparently, I want to believe this is true. I'm not going to even ask anyone if they know it's true or not, because I believe this story is true. Thoreau imprisoned in jail for one night because of failure to pay taxes connected to the US imperialism. And Ralph Waldo Emerson comes to the jail and says, Henry, what are you doing in the cell? And Thoreau's response is, Ralph, why aren't you here with me? I love that story. You can't tell me it's not true. I believe it happened, right? But that's who Thoreau was. He was iconoclastic. He was brash. Now, I'm not saying Douglass wasn't brash and iconoclastic, but Douglass was a movement person. And he refused on many occasions, he didn't always live up to this, but over and over again, especially when he published the second autobiography, and there's 3 of them, by the way. This came out in 1855, My Bondage and My Freedom. It has much more information about the racism that Douglass very strategically underplays in the narrative, because the whole notion of the narrative was show how bad the South is and show once I get freedom in the North, in New Bedford and Boston, it's like nirvana. And I've made it and I've arrived and I've found my community. And the white people here they're too busy to be racist. And he says those types of things in narrative, but 10 years later, My Bondage and My Freedom, he's like, not all is sunny in this beloved fair land. But Douglass refuses, between especially the two autobiographies, to make this a story about just himself. And he says something, in the preface to the second one. I'm gonna need reading glasses. I want to make sure and get this right. So Douglas is talking in his second autobiography about why he wrote the book. It is not to illustrate any heroic achievements of a man, but to vindicate a just and beneficent principle in its application to the whole human family. That is, this is not a story about me. It's a story about all of us. And not just all of us enslaved Black people, but you white people and other people who are not enslaved. Like, what are you going to do about this system? It's not just about me. It's not just about what you believe and what I believe. What are we going to do as part of a movement to change things? And again, I look back to Douglas's first effort to free himself, the Sabbath school experience, the community that was built. Of course, we know that the effort fails. There's a person who acted as an informant, who was a slave, but nonetheless, this is the kind of the school that Douglas learns from. This is the university of hard knocks that our parents taught us about as kids, right? And I think this is what separates or what differentiates a Frederick Douglass from an Emerson or from a Thoreau. His trip to Ireland is decisive. It changes his life. It changes the life of many people that he comes in contact with. He goes there during the famine. He goes there during this incredible movement, the Young Ireland movement, Daniel O'Connell, and all these people. And he tells us what an impact that had on him. Here's the handout, Frederick Douglass in Belfast, Ireland. And he's so blown away that he speaks, he speaks to the same cause that Daniel O'Connell supports. O'Connell was an icon in the transatlantic world of freedom fighters. Douglass, though, has to be careful because it's the Wilberforces and the English Anti-Slavery Society people that have brought him to the British Isles. Their position on Ireland, we'll just say it's complicated. But Douglass finds different ways to show solidarity for people in Belfast. When Sheila and I were there in 2014, Frederick Douglass is a living, breathing human being, according to the working class neighborhoods of Belfast, West Belfast. They love Frederick Douglass. School children there are taught about him. They know more about Frederick Douglass than my own university students until they've read narrative. Roy, you don't get to 90 in Belfast without reading this book. And I think it's because Douglass was seen as a stand-up person. He said, teach me. I don't know all of what's happening here to the Irish people. And it was that openness and his ability to understand oppression beyond his own group that is one of the things that really sets him apart. Scotland, Wales, he has incredible experiences in all those places. And he gains an understanding for the first time of imperialism. This is how the British do it. And unfortunately, we learn too well from our British masters. And I put this quote in my book, In African American and Latinx History of the United States. In many ways, it frames the whole entire book, is that it's US imperialism which will lead to the disastrous Civil War. Why do we invade Mexico? Why do we attack the Seminoles? Why do we do all these terrible things? It's the profits and the seductions of slavery. But I argue that Douglass has to go to Ireland to see the oppression of the Irish people that helps cement his ideas about the ways that imperialism and oppression takes place, and also the ways to argue against it. So just a few more slides to share with you. This is a very fond memory. Sheila and I were in West Belfast. I was asked to give some lectures on, not in Northern Ireland, Wales or Scotland, I can't remember, but I was asked to give some lectures about World War I. It was 100th anniversary of the war, the Great War. And we were in West Belfast for just a couple of days, and I went looking for the West Falls. This is West Falls Road. This is one of the most famous thoroughfares in the world. More people come here to study the art, and we could spend hours. The murals are just incredible. But many of the murals are temporary. That is, they're based upon certain political struggles that happen and then end, and then you paint over them. This is permanent. The Frederick Douglass mural in West Belfast, the backdrop is one of the notorious British incarceration facilities where people were tortured and disappeared. And you can see, if you look closely, this is the old peace line, what they used to call the peace line in Belfast. So there's barbed wire on top of that wall. But this is a permanent mural. And when I asked about murals, I know the deal when I go into West Belfast, and Sheila and I both wanted to pay homage to the mural dedicated to Bobby Sands. And so we asked, where's the mural to Bobby Sands? Of course, he died in a hunger strike. And the shopkeeper of the shop that we went into, she closed her shop down. She got her neighbors. She walked us over to the Bobby Sands mural, and she passed us off to friends, and she said, these Americans are here to pay honor to Bobby. And so do whatever they tell you. They were like, and the idea was, we want them to go back to tell their fellow Americans that we Irish people are not animals, that we have a culture. We know how we're represented to you back in the States. So this photograph, West Falls Road is normally, if you're familiar with the road, it's packed with traffic. They stopped traffic for me to take this photograph, and others like it. And I was just it was just, tears. I mean, it was just so moving. Here's a close-up of the mural in 2014, and you can see around it other political struggles. You can see President Obama was added, and then you can see Nelson Mandela, Angela Davis, and other people from Latin America. So what is to the slave the 4th of July? I think what I'll do now is kind of open it up for questions. I think we've been here quite a while, and just a few more slides to share. Like I said, though, you can kind of read these on your own leisure. But thank you for being a great audience. I really appreciate it.
Can you help pass it?
Okay, I get the first question. Thank you. And super presentation, of course. Thanks for doing this year after year. I have a question about Douglas's relationship to religion, and particularly, he has religion runs throughout his book that we read, but particularly at the postscript, and where he talks about the fact that he's not really against religion, but then he goes one after other examples of how religion is hypocritical, and those who perform it are really not operating in the best interests of what a Christian is meant to be. Where did his commitment to Christianity come from, and his own personal ideas of what it should be?
Yeah, that's a great question, because Christianity, and I think to answer that, Rick, I think one text to take a look at would be, history professor always has to give more reading assignments. My Bondage and My Freedom. Now, if you haven't read that, that's the second autobiography, and Douglas goes into more detail about Christianity in particular. And of course, at one point in his life, he really wanted to become a minister, and he was a minister. He did, and he had a Sabbath school, but he also periodically did preach the Christian doctrine as he understood it. And as he understood it is very critical because, as you pointed out in the narrative, he goes out of his way to highlight how Christianity had been perverted to support slavery. And this is the most important philosophical argument, I believe, of the 18th and 19th century over the long term. It's an argument between enslaved people and their masters over what is the purpose and the kind of metaphysical foundations of this religion. A great answer is found in Howard Thurman's book, Jesus and the Disinherited. That would be another great text for us to read together. Howard Thurman was a native Floridian. He got his Christianity the same way that Douglas did, from his elders. In Thurman's case, his grandmother. And his grandmother, when Thurman was growing up, this is in the early 20th century, and his grandmother, who had been a slave in Madison County, Florida, would have Thurman read, the young Thurman, the boy, read her passages of the Bible. But she forbade him to read the Pauline epistles, which include the verses about, slaves, obey thy masters. And this disturbed Thurman greatly because he wanted to believe in this religion. But if there's a whole part of this book that you're not supposed to read, what happened? What went wrong? And so Jesus and the Disinherited is an effort that Thurman makes based upon slave religion, slave Christianity, to, as he puts it, to put Christianity back into its original orientation, which is that it was a religion for people who lived their entire lives with their backs against the wall. Oppressed people, poor people. Thurman's argument was that was what Christianity was in its original iteration. We can argue with that historically, but that was an organic understanding of Christianity that came out of the slave communities, not just Douglas and not just Thurman. So that's the argument that's going on. And Douglas was a pretty devout Christian, but he argued over and over again, this is not a Christian nation. He argued that, during slavery, he argued that years after slavery, his last great speeches were about lynching. He said the people engaged in lynching say they're Christians. Well, how does that work? So yeah, caught in a lot of, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. That was an excellent talk. My question is about the eloquence of the writing, because if you think about it, he was a slave, and Thoreau went to Concord Academy, and Emerson went to Harvard. How did he get to the point where he could write that way?
Well, he got to the point, and this is something where I'm a bit out of my element because literary scholars have worked on this challenge. Because again, remember that when he began writing, and this wasn't specific or unique to him, but anytime any former slave started writing, there was the suspicious flags raised. Well, was it really them, writing? So literary scholars have looked at Douglas's writings over the generations, and they said, yeah, this is basically a younger writer who begins, he's kind of, formulaic in certain things. There's tropes he's borrowing from, a lot of literary allusions. I would say one place is the Bible. I mean, there's so much, Douglas's writing is so biblical that there's entire passages you have to kind of and when he wrote in the Frederick Douglass paper, these essays that were like 6 or 7 pages long, it's rare when there's not at least an allusion to biblical passages, if not entire quotes. So that's one source. The other thing is that Douglas becomes an avid reader. Now, I try to make this pitch to my University of Florida students all the time because some of them ask me, Professor Ortiz, how does one become a good writer? I say, there's no shortcuts. You have to become a good reader. Oh, we got to read these books. Yes. So Douglas was an avid reader. We know that and again, The Frederick Douglass paper that he edited for a number of years, and then he edited the New National Era after the war. It's like a smorgasbord of literature. It's really fun to read. I actually read narrative before I read Walden, and the reason that I read them in that sequence was that someone said, well, Paul, you didn't know that narrative had a decisive impact in the way that Thoreau wrote Walden. And that great essay that Thoreau wrote on civil disobedience, that's taken from reading Douglass, not just Douglass, but Margaret Fuller as well, obviously, and other people. So, and it was such a great, I don't want to romanticize things because it was slavery times, but just imagine being a writer in the 1840s or 1850s. My God. Fuller, Whitman, Melville, Emerson, Thoreau, Stowe. Good night. Can you imagine being alive during the time? So that's some of my, so Douglass obviously had the spark, which none of us can teach. All we can do is nurture it. But he also read heavily.
Other questions, comments? Online?
And I think we know I'm passing the microphone. I think it makes all the world of difference that he's writing about what he wants to write about. He's gaining a sense of himself, of his identity through his writing. I'm just kind of thinking out loud here now. And he's passionate, right? It's not an assignment. The professor didn't tell him to write about the pros and cons of slavery. He's writing about something he really passionately believes in.
A week ago, I was waiting around the Acorn Room, just down the hall, and there's this bookcase that has very fancy books, gilded edges and so on. And looking through it, I picked out Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery.
All right.
And I'm about halfway through it. And it is amazing, I think. It's not fancy literary, but it's clear and it's precise and it's truthful. And he was nearly a grown man when he was freed from slavery, and he had to walk all the way across West Virginia to find a place where he could go to school, but he wanted to learn to read. And having learned to read, his full passion thereafter was to teach other people to read. And he founded the Tuscaloosa Academy, and he reminds me. I don't know how, if he had ever read Douglass. Douglass was older than Booker T. Washington, but what you tell us here reminds me a lot of Booker T. Washington.
It's a great comparison, and their lives overlapped a bit. Douglass was a strong supporter of Tuskegee Institute at the time. He helped raise funds for that institution. You'll be glad to know that on our Mississippi trip this year, and I was telling Roy during lunch, I actually took our UF students to Tuskegee University, and we spent a day there. We interviewed some of the administrators. We got a tour from a student ambassador, and it was who's majoring in agricultural sciences, which is one of the top majors at Tuskegee University. Historically black college and university. Booker T. Washington was a big fan of Hampton. Actually, that's where he's interred. He graduated from Hampton, so there's a connection between Hampton as HBCU and Tuskegee as an HBCU. But I'm so glad you mentioned that, because it fits into what Douglass tried to do, but was very frustrated and was very inspired by people of Washington's generation. But also, I think, had he lived, would have been incredibly inspired by people like Mary McLeod Bethune. Douglass wanted Black people to build enduring institutions. And because of the political crises of the late 19th century, That was very difficult to do. But Tuskegee was one of those places that stuck. It held together. And it wasn't just Booker T. Washington's genius. The man was a genius. Very different politically than Douglas. That's another discussion. But this is what Tuskegee meant to its students. Let me see if I can frame this properly so that we can all kind of understand the importance of Tuskegee. Early in its history, as a Black institution teaching Black students how to read and analyze, et cetera, build things. The students, by the way, built most of the original buildings on the campus. Many of those are still extant. The Ku Klux Klan was not a big fan of Tuskegee Institute. And so on more than one occasion, they would lead big marches to the campus to burn it down. We know of at least 7 or 8 of these. The last one shortly after World War I. And on every occasion, imagine those of us who are retired faculty and administrators getting their high-powered rifles and surrounding the campus to defend their campus. Now that's something. I think about that all. And we went there, I told my students that story, and they said, there's no way professors would have done that. Pick up a high-powered rifle to defend your camp. I mean, we think we have it bad now. Imagine the Ku Klux Klan marched on your campus to burn it down. But that's what Tuskegee meant to its students and its community. I loved going there. And one of the things and what we saw, George Washington Carver is buried there. And people come from all over the world to visit his tomb in the middle of campus. Imagine, Clemson has John Calhoun. Tuskegee has Dr. Carver. There's an interesting lesson there somewhere. But I remember two of my students were members of that really cool group on campus. What's it called? The Cicerones. You know, they do campus tours. And they were, and it's very competitive to get into that program. You have to do interviews, and you have to do all these performance things. And the students who were in the Cicerones said, "This is the most amazing college tour we've ever been on." The docent didn't talk about student life, didn't talk about the big game, and they have a big game there, big competition. You know, Tuskegee, it's one of the Atlanta school, Morehouse, that's their big competitor, right? The game of tigers, they call it, okay? But our tour guides are saying, wow, they know the history of all these buildings, who they're named after. Rosenwald. The ambassador knew all about Rosenwald. Incredible. Anyway, I'm starting to ramble. Sorry about that. But the importance of building institutions.
Again, I'm just echoing what other people have said. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I have a question about Douglas's status as a public intellectual, because especially these days, I'm often searching for one that speaks as eloquently as he did about a wide variety of issues of the day. So he didn't just speak about slavery, but freedom and war and economy and so many things. And in fact, the only person I can think of these days who would come close is somebody like James Baldwin. But my question to you is, I understand that he really was a very insightful and very inventive speaker about issues that were read about by educated people, but I wonder how influential or how far-reaching his ideas were, his readings were, to a broader spectrum of the public, especially considering the educational level of the 19th century of most people. And I wonder how broadly disseminated these ideas were. Were his ideas, do you think, only really read in college or among, literate social circles?
It's a great question. And I think that part of the answer is, it's really hard to think of any contemporary example of someone who is kind of like Frederick Douglass, but yet they're there. And I think about the anti-slavery movement as a global movement. Think about it as being powered by a lecture circuit, subscriptions, fundraising was constant, petitions were constant. The most moving exercise I think I've ever had as a historian, not having to do with oral history, is going to the National Archives last summer and spending days reading these incredible anti-slavery petitions. I wept because I'm reading these petitions, and these are people from towns I've never heard of in my entire life. And some of these towns no longer exist. And thousands of people took the time to put their pen to paper, to take risks. Because if you were against slavery in a town like Cincinnati or anywhere in the Ohio River Basin, and you publicly came out against slavery in the North, that was taking a risk. You were risking your life. And to see so many thousands of these, literally thousands of these petitions, but at the same time, to think about, I'll use a term, this is a historical mismatch, civic engagement. Because when these petitions were being crafted and sent to Congress, Congress had a thing called the gag rule. And congressmen weren't even allowed to read these petitions or even talk about them on the floor of Congress. Because so many people were trying to make their voices heard about slavery. Shut it down. Charles Dickens wrote about this at length during his famous sojourn. We talked a bit about this when we read Great Expectations. And of all the episodes and Dickens was ready for slavery. He was ready to go to the South. He was opposed to slavery. But what he wasn't ready for was the hypocrisy of the gag rule. He was stunned by it. But this gets back to that this was a movement. And I think that the writers whose names we don't quite know, like when I read the Frederick Douglass paper, or even William Lloyd Garrison's paper, a lot of the writers are anonymous, again, for pretty good reasons, right? But how eloquent they were. I just wish I would be able to talk to some of them. The ones, there's a lot we know the names of. But, I was in DC last summer and they had the Poor People's Campaign. There were like 70,000 people there. The media didn't report it at all. And I just sat and just listened to speech after speech. And I remember thinking, who are these people? These are such eloquent speeches about the issue of poverty. But they were done within a tradition of kind of Black liberation theology, which you can trace to Douglass and go back further. And the tradition was the rule of the speakers there, and it was the New Poor People's Campaign, which is co-chaired by Reverend William Barber, who's now he's the founding chair of the Yale. There's a Yale religious social justice institute they just founded up there, and I get the sister. It's Liz Theo Harris, brilliant scholar. They were co-chairs of this Poor People's March, and the speakers, the eloquence was just so incredible. These are the people, and James Baldwin would have been incredibly gratified to have been there. But this was the rule that Reverend Barber set for all those speeches, 8 hours of speeches. No politicians would speak. Only 2 academics spoke the whole day. One of them, Cornel West, who was definitely a great public intellectual. But I think the reason it was such an amazing, passionate, eloquent day was the rule was that if we're going to talk about poverty, it's poor people who speak here. And their poor people came from every state of the union. And a lot of Native Americans from Wyoming and Montana, a lot of Asian Americans from like the Bay Area in California and the Central Valley, where poverty among Asian Americans is horrific. You know, people from the Southeast. So there's people out there, I think. Yeah, I'm kind of rambling again, but.
Okay, let's thank Professor Ortiz for another wonderful
you.
presentation. and
Thank you
discussion.
so much.